Hey guys, it's me, Ryan Swag. This is a clip from my live stream, SwagTips. In this live stream, I went over some intricacies about Draco Meteor Dragonite. This particular clip compares Draco Meteor Dragonite to Outrage Dragonite to Draco Meteor Salamence, with some specific scenarios that show where each of these three kind of have unique advantages and allows us to draw some real scenario kind of conclusions about which moves better. So I hope you enjoy it. I found it to be pretty interesting. So you might recognize this graph a little bit. It is very similar to the one I used for my Salamence content that I recently uploaded to YouTube. It was my live stream last week, where it's considering the DPS trends of level 40 attackers against an Air/Aerial Ace Rayquaza raid. And I titled this graph Draco Meteor DPS Light. And the reason why I'm saying light is because the Aerial Ace Rayquaza raid is a very non-threatening raid for Dragonite and also Salamence. I also included Salamence here because since we're talking about Draco Meteor, I think it'd be kind of interesting to get the other Draco Meteor user, the OG Draco Meteor, I guess, into the argument here, into the discussion. Air/Aerial Ace, so it's a non-threatening fight where if you have Outrage Rayquaza, it's a threatening fight because the Outrage does crazy huge damage to them. So the blue line here is representing Draco Meteor Salamence because he's blue. The orange line is representing the OG Dragonite, the Outrage one, which I mean technically isn't the OG one, but more OG than Draco Meteor. And then the red one is the new boy, which is the Draco Meteor Dragonite. So you're looking at this and you see the average performance for Draco Meteor Dragonite is below Outrage Dragonite. And you're looking at all these situations, all these simulations. It's 100 simulation sorted from lowest to highest DPS in this particular fight. And you see that for the most part, Draco Meteor is doing worse than Outrage. And rather than that 80% that was pitched from Bioweapon and Double Felix's model, this is like the little Apex boy here. And of the absolute simulations that we have, it's like kind of more like 90. And of course, this is a particular moveset using exclusively level 40 Pokemon, so different movesets, different levels will have, different results to one degree or another. So you got that going on. And as far as like the absolute versus the average, it looks like 35 of Draco Meteor Dragonite's simulations are doing better than Outrage's average. So it stands to reason to say that, you got that whole situation where it's like the worst Outrage is still better than the worst Draco Meteor, but the best Draco Meteor is better than the best Outrage. So a little risk reward, a little push your luck. If you're going up against the Air/Aerial Ace Rayquaza raid and you're bringing in a Dragonite, you'd probably want to be bringing the Outrage one. Now what I find to be interesting here is that you've got Draco Meteor Salamence, and he's just straight pimping it well above them. I don't have to, we got the line there, so that's kind of like 30%. So about 70% of the Draco Meteor Salamence simulations are doing better than Outrage's average. And still, you still have that drop off where it's like, oh, well, the worst Draco Meteor is still worse than the worst Outrage, but Salamence is looking pretty fly here. And the reason why is because this is a non-threatening fight. And to begin with, Salamence's baseline DPS is higher than Dragonite's. It's got a higher base attack stat, which means that its Dragon Tails are doing more damage than Dragonite's. And when you consider that Dragon Tail damage is a huge part of your DPS and your total damage output, it sets the bar that much higher for the DPS. It stands to reason that, overall, the Salamence will be having more DPS than the Dragonite in this non-threatening fight. And once again, another dimension to this too is the total damage output. This is just the DPS alone, total damage output, which is essentially your tankiness, how much damage you're doing before you faint. Dragonite is typically ahead of Salamence always, so that's a dimension that's kind of lost on this. But DPS, we're in kind of a DPS focused meta, so it stands to reason to include that in here. Right? Yeah. And even then, if you look at the averages, they're still pretty dang close. I mean, that's not even half a DPS right there. That's maybe a quarter of a DPS difference on average. It just looks more dramatic because you got that huge spike with the Draco Meteor here. So another thing to consider about these DPS differences. So overall, if you're looking at this non-threatening, light kind of damage situation, in the Rayquaza raid, you still got that kind of like risk-reward scenario going on with Draco Meteor, where it's like if you roll the dice and you roll the dice high, then hey, Draco Meteor worked out for you. But if you roll the dice low, maybe you want to be using Outrage. Now, what gets interesting with this is when you bring in the aggressive situation. So, same Pokemon, same color coding, still the Rayquaza raid, but this is the Dragontail Outrage Rayquaza. So, different situation here, and I call this the aggressive situation because this is where, like, okay, to put things in perspective, a level 40 Dragonite can tank 1 Outrage and 1 Dragontail from Rayquaza and still survive with at least 1 HP, which, if you remember from my Bulk Point 102 video or live stream, or if you're hip with bulk points, if you're not, I suggest checking them out because bulk points are pretty big in Pokemon Go. It's when they matter. They're not as pervasive as break points, but bulk points kind of important. But yeah, what I went over in that was that gives Dragonite enough time to use another charge move, such as Draco Meteor, where Salamence, on the other hand, faints from a single Outrage and a Dragontail. Actually, even at lower levels, I don't know the cutoff, you can use the bulk point tool on Pokebattler. It's really easy to use, especially if you know about bulk points. So if you don't know about bulk points, enlighten yourself. If you use the bulk point calculator and stuff, you'll find that at lower levels, Salamence just straight up faints to Outrage from Rayquaza. And at higher levels, it can tolerate 1 Outrage, but then it'll faint to the next fast move, which isn't nearly enough time to get off a Draco Meteor, especially when you consider that the Outrage from the raid boss only has a 50 energy cost, so it happens way sooner and way less predictably than a single bar charge move, which is why Salamence is straight tanking it here, while Dragonite's still managing to fly pretty high despite any disadvantages involved. So, I mean, I actually expected Salamence to do a lot worse, but this is considering 100 simulations, random simulations, against the raid boss Rayquaza from Pokebattler. So there are simulations where Salamence does win and does get to use Draco Meteor, and it's great and he feels good and it's awesome. But you got these super unawesome situations here. So yeah. But another thing that stood out to me about this fight, and what inspired me to make the aggressive versus light graphs in the first place, was the average for Draco Meteor ends up being higher than Outrage for Dragonite. And I was like, whoa, what's going on here? Because all the other sort of simulations from Pokebattler are selling that Outrage is like basically always better. So I wanted to investigate what's going on. And so a common argument, a common debate that you'll probably see when it comes to Draco Meteor versus Outrage that I echoed earlier was that you've got the situation where you have an Outrage and you use an Outrage, and one Outrage is way better than just using no Draco Meteors, right? Now, if you use 2 Outrages, you know, it's like slightly behind using 1 Draco Meteor. Now you got the next situation where you can only get off 1 Draco Meteor and then, aw dang, you fainted, but it was enough time for someone to get 3 Outrages off. Well, the 3 is going to be better than the 1 Draco Meteors, so, right? So you got those trade-offs going on. And looking at this fight specifically, it's kind of like that, it really kind of stokes the 1 versus 1 situation and the 1 versus 2 situation. In this particular fight at level 40, looking specifically at the battle logs for Pokebattler, seeing what's really going on in their simulated battles, Draco Meteor, right? Dragonite has enough tankiness, you know, being able to survive an Outrage and a Dragontail, and then fainting on a second Dragontail. That's enough time for it to get off 1 Draco Meteor. That situation, though, is just, like, on average, just not always enough time for it to get off 2 Outrages, though. So this more aggressive situation ends up being a scenario where Dragonite with Draco Meteor is slightly better. And then for Salamence, since Salamence doesn't have that bulkiness, it doesn't have the tankiness to survive an Outrage and a charge move, that's why it's like tanking hard over here. And one thing that's kind of interesting about this too is a lot of their DPS And a lot of the reason why their averages end up being pretty similar despite the changes in the charge moves is because a lot of their damage, a lot of their DPS is coming from their Dragon Tails. And Salaменce's baseline Dragon Tail damage is higher than Dragonite's. Alright, so Salamence's baseline DPS is 18.18. And then the Dragonite's Dragon Tail DPS is 17.27. So about 1 DPS higher for the baseline. And 1 DPS is pretty significant. So what's happening here, the baseline is 18. So it'd be really weird if it dropped below 18, since the Dragon Tails are always going to be at least doing that. Well, what's happening is that it's like almost kind of having enough time for a Draco Meteor. And because Draco Meteor has an animation time of 3.9 seconds, and the active damage time is roughly around 3 seconds in it, if it doesn't land the Draco Meteor in those 3 seconds and it faints from Rayquaza within those 3 seconds, right, then it has essentially up to 3 seconds of it doing absolutely nothing. It's just standing there looking pretty, doing its best, trying to Draco Meteor, and then it faints. And then because it spent that time doing nothing, and because the time that Salamence is even going to be alive in the fight is only like 12 seconds to begin with, so it's spending like a fourth of its time doing nothing, you got a huge DPS drop there. And that kind of brings in another kind of consideration about the models that I'm using for DPS here, and how even they might be inaccurate because they're based off of Pokebattler. And I'm not saying that Pokebattler is super inaccurate or anything, it is the best simulator that we have, but a slight limitation that Pokebattler has is that it doesn't, or at least I assume it doesn't, right? Because I guess I don't perfectly know how well Solandro, the code writer for Pokebattler, considers glitches. But we do have the rebounding damage glitch, where if you use a charge move yourself and it lands, but you faint soon after, then the raid boss all of a sudden gets its health back. I mean, that kind of trims off these situations a little bit here, because the spike here in DPS is when you faint immediately after using your charge move, because every fast move you use after a charge move brings down your average DPS some more, because that's just how DPS works, right? It kind of shaves off these situations and adds more to these situations. So yeah, it's like another kind of risk that comes with Draco Meteor, which is, I guess, another reason why, in spite of it being 1 DPS higher here, it's still overall probably a bit riskier, maybe too risky to use, in comparison to Outrage, where you're likely to get off that, you will get off 1 Outrage against Rayquaza with your Dragonite, but it's a little bit more in question if you're going to get off a Draco Meteor or 2 Outrages. So the whole Draco Meteor versus Outrage debate surmised. I just thought it was kind of interesting how Draco Meteor Salamence was doing way worse in this raid, when the Draco Meteor Dragonite was doing better. And then in the light situation, you had the opposite, where it was like the Outrage Dragonite doing better than the Draco Meteor, but now the Draco Meteor Salamence is doing way better than the Outrage Dragonite. So I guess this is kind of like all kind of looping it up into a nice little burrito for you, that once again the argument isn't so simple as saying that one is just straight up flat out 100% better than the other one, but that Outrage is more often going to be better than Draco Meteor, to the point where if for whatever reason you don't get a Draco Meteor Dragonite on Community Day, you don't have to sweat it too much. I mean, it's a cool novelty, and I want to use a Draco Meteor attack in a raid because that animation is so sick, but you're not missing out as far as performance goes. So yeah, that was a clip from my live stream SwagTips. SwagTips streams every Thursday at 7 p.m. Central Time on the Twitch channel SwagTips. If you like this content, then, like, comment, subscribe. This is YouTube, man. What would you want me to say? SwagTips. Hey guys, letting you know that for Community Day, it's very likely now that we're going to be seeing shiny members of the Draco Dragonite family. The shiny assets have been recently added to the Pokemon Go network, so it stands to reason that it is more likely now, more than it was before, that we will be seeing a shiny Dratini on Community Day. So that's pretty dang hype.